The weathered marble sarcophagus of the Vespucci family mausoleum, its sealed chamber containing over 3,000 ancient Byzantine manuscripts and Roman imperial artifacts worth $600 million, alongside encrypted stone codices that would rewrite everything historians thought they knew about the fall of Constantinople. The discovery that would transform my understanding of why my great-great-grandmother really fled Venice in 1891. Before we dive into this incredible journey, tell me where you're watching from in the comments below. And if stories like this captivate you, make sure you're subscribed with notifications on, because tomorrow I've got something even more extraordinary lined up for you. I'm Isabella Vespucci-Castellano. My great-great-grandmother, Serafina Vespucci, arrived at Ellis Island on March 15, 1891, carrying nothing but a worn leather portfolio and what immigration officials described in their records as an unusual collection of ancient Byzantine manuscripts that nearly got her detained for suspected forgery. Unlike the thousands of other Italian immigrants fleeing poverty for America's promise of prosperity, Serafina had something entirely different driving her across the Atlantic. She wasn't escaping economic hardship. She was fleeing from something far more sinister, something that had already claimed the lives of her husband, her brother, and two prominent Venetian scholars who had been found floating face down in the Grand Canal just weeks before her desperate departure. Serafina had been one of Venice's most respected paleographers, a rare woman in the 1880s who could read and authenticate ancient Greek, Latin, and Byzantine texts. She worked directly with the Biblioteca Marciana, Venice's legendary library, cataloging manuscripts that had been accumulating in their archives since the fall of Constantinople in 1453. The position was extraordinary for a woman of her era. She had earned it through sheer intellectual brilliance and the support of progressive scholars who recognized her unique talents in deciphering ancient scripts that had puzzled academics for centuries. Her workspace in the library's restricted section was filled with documents that most people would consider priceless relics. But to Serafina, they were living connections to civilizations that had shaped the modern world. She could read Latin as fluently as Italian, understood Greek better than most classical scholars, and possessed an intuitive grasp of Byzantine administrative Greek that made her invaluable for interpreting imperial chronicles and ecclesiastical documents from the Eastern Roman Empire. But in December 1890, while working late one evening in the library's deepest archives, she made a discovery among the uncatalogued Byzantine documents that changed everything. Hidden within a collection of seemingly routine administrative records from the 15th century, she found a series of encrypted imperial chronicles that revealed the true circumstances surrounding Constantinople's fall. These weren't the heroic accounts of Christian defenders overwhelmed by Ottoman forces that had been accepted by historians for over 400 years. These were secret imperial communications that documented systematic betrayal from within the city's own walls. The manuscripts contained detailed records of communications between certain Byzantine nobles and Ottoman commanders, revealing that key defenders of Constantinople had been systematically bribed to abandon their posts during the final siege. More damaging still, the documents identified specific Venetian and Genoese merchant families who had secretly financed the Ottoman war effort while publicly contributing to the city's defense. These families had played both sides of the conflict, ensuring they would profit regardless of the outcome while appearing to support their Christian allies. But the most explosive revelations concerned the systematic looting of Constantinople's imperial treasures during the final weeks before the city fell. The chronicles documented a coordinated effort by certain European merchants to evacuate specific artifacts, manuscripts, and precious objects from the imperial palace and the Hagia Sophia before Ottoman forces could claim them. This wasn't the random pillaging that historians had assumed. It was an organized operation that had been planned months in advance by people who knew exactly when and how the city would fall. The documents included detailed inventories of artifacts that had been systematically removed from Constantinople and shipped to various European cities, including Venice, Genoa, Florence, and several locations in France and Germany. Religious relics, imperial regalia, ancient manuscripts, and artistic treasures that the Ottoman Empire had later claimed were destroyed during the conquest had actually been safely transported to European collections where they remained hidden for centuries. Most significantly, the chronicles contained precise maps and location descriptions showing where the most valuable imperial treasures had been concealed throughout the Mediterranean region. The Byzantine emperors, recognizing that Constantinople's fall was inevitable, had organized the evacuation of their most precious possessions to secret locations where they could potentially be recovered by future Christian rulers. These weren't vague references to legendary lost treasures. These were detailed logistical records showing exactly where specific collections had been hidden and who was responsible for guarding them.
As Serafina worked to translate and authenticate these extraordinary documents, she began to understand why they had remained uncatalogued in the library's archives for so long. The implications weren't just historical. They were potentially catastrophic for some of Europe's most prominent families. Several noble houses that had built their modern fortunes and political influence on their claimed role in defending Christian Europe against Ottoman expansion were revealed to have been active collaborators in Christianity's greatest defeat. These families had maintained their power for over 400 years based on carefully constructed myths about their ancestors' heroic efforts to save Constantinople. Their wealth, their titles, their political influence, and their social position all depended on historical narratives that the documents Serafina had discovered proved to be completely false. If these manuscripts became public knowledge, the resulting scandals could destroy dynasties that had shaped European politics for centuries. Serafina understood the historical significance of her discovery, but she initially had no sense of the personal danger it would bring to her family. She began the careful work of creating detailed translations and photographic copies of the most important documents, following the scholarly protocols she had learned during her years at the library. She planned to present her findings at the next meeting of the Venice Archaeological Society, believing that the academic community would be thrilled by such an important contribution to Byzantine studies. Her first indication that powerful people knew about her discovery came in early January 1891, when her husband Lorenzo began receiving visits from well-dressed strangers who claimed to be interested in purchasing rare manuscripts for private collectors. Lorenzo operated a small antiquarian business from their home, so such inquiries weren't unusual. But these visitors seemed more interested in asking questions about Serafina's work at the library than in examining the books and artifacts Lorenzo had available for sale. The questions were subtle but persistent. The visitors wanted to know what projects Serafina was working on, whether she had discovered anything particularly significant recently, and whether she maintained copies of important documents at home for her research. Lorenzo, proud of his wife's scholarly achievements, initially answered their questions freely, not recognizing that he was providing information that could be used against his family. When Lorenzo mentioned these conversations to Serafina, she immediately understood that her discovery had somehow become known to the wrong people. The visitors' questions were too specific and too focused to be coincidental. Someone was systematically investigating her work, and they possessed enough detailed knowledge about Byzantine manuscripts to ask informed questions about her research methods and findings. Serafina's fears were confirmed when she returned to the library after the New Year holiday to find that her workspace had been carefully searched. Nothing appeared to be missing, and the disturbance was so subtle that most people wouldn't have noticed it. But Serafina knew exactly how she had arranged her materials, and she could see that someone had examined her translations, photographed certain pages, and attempted to access the secure cases where the original manuscripts were stored. The violation of her workspace was accomplished with sophisticated techniques that suggested professional capabilities far beyond common thieves or academic competitors. The locks had been defeated without damage, the security cases had been opened without triggering their alarm mechanisms, and the searcher had possessed enough knowledge of paleography to identify which of her many projects involved the Byzantine chronicles. This was clearly the work of someone with substantial resources and specialized expertise. Realizing that her family was now in serious danger, Serafina began taking precautions that she hoped would protect them while allowing her to continue her research. She moved the original manuscripts to a different location within the library, created multiple copies of her most important translations, and began keeping crucial documents at home where she could monitor their security personally. She also started varying her daily routines and paying careful attention to whether she was being followed or observed. But despite her precautions, tragedy struck with shocking swiftness. On January 8, 1891, Lorenzo was found dead in his study, slumped over his desk, where he had apparently been examining a Byzantine coin that a potential customer had brought for authentication. The official cause of death was listed as sudden cardiac arrest, but Serafina knew immediately that her husband had been murdered. Lorenzo was only 35 years old and had never shown any signs of heart problems. He was in excellent physical condition, maintained an active lifestyle, and had been examined by a physician just 3 months ago for an insurance policy with no indication of cardiac issues. More suspicious still, the Byzantine coin he had supposedly been examining when he died had vanished from his study, along with several of Serafina's research notes that she had stored in their home safe. The police investigation was perfunctory and clearly influenced by parties who wanted Lorenzo's death classified as natural causes as quickly as possible. The investigating officer, Commissario Benedetti, seemed more interested in discouraging questions than in examining evidence. He dismissed Serafina's concerns about the missing coin and documents, suggesting that her grief was causing her to imagine suspicious circumstances where none existed.
But Serafina's brother, Antonio, who had rushed to Venice from Padua as soon as he heard about Lorenzo's death, immediately recognized that his sister's fears were justified. Antonio was a professor of Byzantine history at the University of Padua, and he had been following Serafina's research with great interest. He understood both the historical significance of her discoveries and the potential danger they represented for certain powerful families. Antonio insisted on conducting his own investigation into Lorenzo's death, using his academic connections and his knowledge of Venice to ask questions that the official police investigation had ignored. Within a few days, he had discovered that Lorenzo had received several more visits from mysterious collectors in the weeks before his death, and that these visitors had been asking increasingly specific questions about Serafina's work and the location of certain documents. More disturbing, Antonio learned from neighbors that Lorenzo's study had been thoroughly searched after his death, but before the police arrived. The search had been conducted by well-dressed individuals who claimed to be assisting with funeral arrangements, but who had clearly been looking for specific documents rather than making preparations for burial. By the time the police conducted their cursory examination of the scene, any evidence of foul play had been carefully eliminated. Antonio's investigation was making dangerous people nervous. On January 20th, 1891, just 12 days after Lorenzo's death, Antonio was found dead in the Bacchiglione River near the University of Padua. The official explanation was that he had slipped and fallen during an evening walk, struck his head on the riverbank, and drowned in the shallow water. But like Lorenzo's death, the circumstances were highly suspicious to anyone who knew Antonio personally. Antonio was an excellent swimmer who had grown up along the Bacchiglione and knew every inch of its banks near the university. He was also methodical and cautious by nature, never taking unnecessary risks, and had no reason to be walking alone near the river in January. Most tellingly, the research materials he had gathered about Lorenzo's death were missing from his apartments when the police searched them, along with copies of several Byzantine documents that Serafina had shared with him. The third death was what finally convinced Serafina that she was dealing with ruthless enemies who would kill anyone who threatened their secrets. Dr. Giovanni Falliere, a respected paleographer from the Venetian Academy of Sciences, had been examining some of the Byzantine manuscripts at Serafina's request, providing independent authentication of their significance and historical accuracy. Dr. Falliere was scheduled to present his findings to the Academy in early March, lending scholarly credibility to Serafina's discoveries that would make them impossible for powerful families to suppress or discredit. On February 20, 1891, just 12 days after Lorenzo's death, Dr. Falliere was discovered floating in the Grand Canal near the Rialto Bridge. The authorities claimed he had been drinking heavily at a tavern and had fallen from the bridge while walking home. But Serafina knew this explanation was false. Dr. Falliere suffered from a liver condition that prohibited him from consuming alcohol, and he was famously careful about his health and daily routines. More significantly, the copies of the manuscripts he had been studying were missing from both his office at the Academy and his private residence. 3 men dead in 6 weeks, all connected to the same Byzantine documents, all killed in ways that could be explained as natural causes or accidents by authorities who seemed eager to avoid further investigation. Serafina realized she was facing enemies with unlimited resources, sophisticated capabilities, and absolutely no hesitation about committing murder to protect secrets that had been hidden for over 400 years. The pattern was clear and terrifying. These weren't random crimes or the work of common criminals. This was a systematic elimination campaign directed by people who possessed detailed knowledge of Serafina's research, access to her personal and professional contacts, and the ability to kill skilled, cautious men while making their deaths appear accidental. Most ominously, the killers were clearly working from inside information about Serafina's activities, suggesting they had sources within the library, the university, or the scholarly community itself. On February 23, 1891, just 3 days after Dr. Falliere's body was discovered, Serafina received the confirmation that her worst fears were justified. A gentleman arrived at her home in the early evening, impeccably dressed in expensive clothing that marked him as wealthy and possibly foreign. He spoke perfect Italian, but his accent suggested he was from Northern Europe, possibly Germany or Austria. He was accompanied by another man who remained silent, but whose presence was clearly intended to be intimidating. The spokesman introduced himself simply as a representative of certain concerned parties who were aware of her recent research activities. He explained that these parties understood she had discovered documents that could cause great embarrassment to several distinguished European families. He emphasized that these families had no desire to harm her or her daughter, but they were prepared to take whatever measures were necessary to ensure that certain historical materials never became public knowledge.
He offered Serafina a substantial financial settlement, enough money to live comfortably for the rest of her life, in exchange for all copies of the Byzantine manuscripts and her solemn promise to never speak of their contents again. The offer was presented as a generous gesture from families who appreciated her scholarly abilities and wanted to reward her for her discretion. But the underlying threat was unmistakable, especially given the recent deaths of 3 men connected to her research. When Serafina refused the offer, explaining that she had a scholarly obligation to preserve and study the historical documents, the gentleman's demeanor changed completely. He calmly informed her that unfortunate accidents had been befalling people associated with her research, and it would be tragic if similar misfortune came to her or her 8-year-old daughter, Caterina. He gave her 48 hours to reconsider his generous proposal, suggesting she spend that time thinking carefully about whether historical scholarship was more important than her family's continued well-being.
The threat against Caterina eliminated any possibility that Serafina might try to resist or negotiate with her enemies. Whatever risks she might be willing to accept for herself, she could not gamble with her daughter's safety. But she also understood that simply surrendering the documents and promising silence would not guarantee their survival. The people she was dealing with had already demonstrated their willingness to kill potential witnesses, and they would likely view her and Caterina as permanent security risks that could only be eliminated through death. Serafina's only hope was to disappear so completely that her enemies would never find her or the documents she possessed. But this couldn't be a simple flight to another Italian city or even another European country. The people pursuing her clearly had resources and contacts throughout Europe, as demonstrated by their detailed knowledge of her research and their ability to orchestrate multiple murders without triggering serious police investigations. Working through the night of February 24, 1891, Serafina developed a desperate plan that would either save her family or lead to their destruction. She would flee to America, but she would do so in a way that made it impossible for her enemies to track her movements or anticipate her destination. More crucially, she would ensure that the Byzantine documents survived, even if she and Caterina did not, preserving them for future generations who might be able to reveal their contents safely. The plan required her to liquidate every asset she possessed and convert everything to portable wealth that could be transported secretly. She sold her jewelry, her household goods, Lorenzo's antiquarian inventory, and even furniture and clothing that weren't absolutely essential for travel. She used these funds to purchase materials for preserving the manuscripts during long-term storage, and to arrange for complex shipping arrangements that would make her cargo impossible to trace. Most importantly, she used her connections within Venice's academic community to create false documentation suggesting that she was donating certain research materials to American universities for scholarly study. This provided legitimate cover for shipping the Byzantine documents to Boston, while making it appear that she was simply clearing out her late husband's business inventory rather than attempting to hide priceless historical artifacts. On February 26, 1891, just 2 days after receiving the ultimatum from her mysterious visitor, Serafina and Caterina boarded the steamship Sicilia, bound for New York. They carried only a single trunk of essential clothing and the worn leather portfolio containing her research notes that had nearly gotten her detained at Ellis Island. But somewhere in the ship's cargo hold, carefully packed among boxes labeled as academic research materials donated to American institutions, were the original Byzantine manuscripts and photographic copies that represented one of the most significant archaeological discoveries of the 19th century. The Atlantic crossing took 12 days, during which Serafina lived in constant fear that her enemies might have somehow discovered her escape route and arranged to have her killed before she reached America. She stayed in her cabin as much as possible, avoided conversations with other passengers, and maintained careful watch for any signs that she was being observed or followed. Only when the Statue of Liberty appeared on the horizon did she allow herself to believe that the first phase of her desperate plan had succeeded. But reaching America was only the beginning of Serafina's challenges. She had to establish a new identity in a country where she barely spoke the language, find employment that would support herself and Caterina, and somehow create a secure hiding place for documents that European nobles had already killed to suppress. Most importantly, she had to do all of this while remaining invisible to enemies who possessed international resources and might eventually track her to American soil. When Serafina disembarked at Ellis Island on March 15, 1891, she was carrying the seeds of a family legacy that would span over 130 years, protected by secrets that could either secure her descendants' future or lead to their destruction.
Serafina's establishment in Boston required every ounce of determination and resourcefulness that had enabled her to survive the dangers in Venice. Her position at the Boston Public Library's Special Collections Department provided not only essential income, but also the perfect cover for her true activities. While her colleagues saw her as a scholarly refugee, grateful for America's opportunities, she was actually conducting the most elaborate concealment operation of the 19th century. Within her first 6 months in America, Serafina had transformed herself from a terrified exile into a methodical guardian of historical secrets. Her apartment near Beacon Hill became a workshop where she spent her evenings creating additional photographic copies of the Byzantine manuscripts using improved techniques she developed through experimentation. She understood that multiple copies, stored in different locations, would be essential for preserving the documents against both natural disasters and human enemies who might eventually track her to Boston. The construction of her elaborate mausoleum at Mount Auburn Cemetery proceeded through the summer and fall of 1891, with Serafina personally overseeing every detail while maintaining her cover as a grieving widow, creating a memorial for her deceased husband. The contractors she hired were impressed by her knowledge of stone carving and architectural engineering, skills she claimed to have learned from her late husband's antiquarian work, but which actually reflected her deep study of Byzantine building techniques and Venetian architectural traditions. By December 1891, the mausoleum's complex security systems were in place, and Serafina began the delicate process of installing the Byzantine documents in their specially constructed hiding places. Working primarily during winter nights when the cemetery was deserted, she carefully sealed the original manuscripts and her photographic plates in custom-made copper containers designed to protect them from moisture, temperature fluctuations, and chemical degradation over extended periods. The most valuable documents were placed in a hidden chamber beneath the mausoleum's apparent floor, accessible only through a sequence of manipulations involving the carved decorative elements that appeared to be purely artistic. The entrance mechanism required understanding not only the symbolic meaning of the carvings, but also the specific historical references that Serafina had encoded in the iconographic program. Only someone with extensive knowledge of Byzantine history and Venetian traditions would be able to recognize the clues, much less execute the complex procedure required to access the hidden vault. As 1892 began, Serafina received confirmation that her elaborate precautions were necessary. Letters from trusted contacts in Venice, transmitted through careful intermediaries, informed her that European agents had indeed discovered her escape to America and were conducting systematic inquiries about Italian immigrants who had arrived in Boston during early 1891. The search wasn't random. Her enemies clearly possessed detailed information about her departure from Venice and were methodically investigating potential destinations where she might have fled. But Serafina's careful planning had made her nearly impossible to trace through conventional methods. Her immigration records listed her as a widow seeking reunification with distant relatives, a common story among Italian immigrants that attracted no special attention from authorities. Her employment at the library was documented as routine hiring of a qualified research assistant, and her purchase of the cemetery plot appeared to be standard memorial planning by a recently bereaved family. To outside observers, Serafina Vespucci had successfully disappeared into Boston's Italian immigrant community. The true test of Serafina's security measures came in March 1892, exactly 1 year after her arrival in America, when she noticed signs that professional surveillance teams were operating in her neighborhood. Men in expensive clothing who didn't belong in her working-class area were asking carefully casual questions about recent Italian immigrants, particularly women with young daughters who possessed unusual educational backgrounds. The inquiries were subtle and sophisticated, designed to gather information without triggering alarm among the immigrant community. Serafina's response demonstrated the strategic thinking that had enabled her to survive the dangers in Venice. Rather than fleeing Boston immediately, which would have confirmed her enemies' suspicions and possibly led them to discover the hidden documents, she instead strengthened her cover identity while creating additional layers of misdirection. She began attending regular services at the local Catholic church, enrolled Caterina in the parish school, and established visible routines that portrayed her as a devoted mother focused entirely on building a respectable American life for her daughter. Simultaneously, she used her position at the library to create false documentation suggesting that any research materials she had brought from Italy had been donated to various academic institutions throughout New England. Forged correspondence indicated that certain manuscripts had been transferred to Harvard, Yale, and Brown universities for scholarly study.
creating a paper trail that would confuse anyone attempting to locate specific documents. The forgeries were sophisticated enough to withstand casual investigation while directing attention away from Boston and the carefully concealed truth about the document's actual location. Most importantly, Serafina began preparing Caterina for the extraordinary responsibility she would inherit as the next guardian of the family's dangerous secrets. At age 9, Caterina was already demonstrating the intellectual capabilities and emotional strength that would be essential for protecting the Byzantine manuscripts throughout her adult life. Serafina taught her daughter to read Latin and basic Greek, disguising the lessons as cultural education that would help Caterina appreciate her Italian heritage, while actually providing the linguistic skills necessary to understand the hidden documents.
The training extended far beyond language instruction. Serafina carefully taught Caterina the symbolic meaning of every carved element in their family mausoleum, presenting the information as stories about their ancestors and Italian traditions, while actually transmitting the knowledge required to access the hidden chambers. She taught Caterina to memorize complex sequences of information without writing anything down, developing her daughter's ability to preserve crucial knowledge entirely in her memory, where it could never be discovered by enemies or lost to accidents. Most crucially, Serafina began explaining to Caterina why absolute secrecy was essential for their family's survival. Using age-appropriate language, she told her daughter about the dangerous people in Europe who had killed Lorenzo and the others, emphasizing that these enemies possessed resources and patience that could threaten their family for generations. She taught Caterina to recognize signs of surveillance, to vary her routines unpredictably, and to trust no one outside their immediate family with information about their true background or the documents they were protecting. By 1895, Serafina had successfully established herself as a permanent resident of Boston while maintaining perfect security around the hidden Byzantine manuscripts. Her work at the library had earned her promotion to senior research assistant, providing both financial stability and enhanced access to academic resources that helped her continue studying the historical significance of the documents she had preserved. Her scholarly reputation grew within Boston's intellectual community, but always as an expert on general Italian medieval history, rather than the specific Byzantine materials that remained her secret obsession. Caterina, now 12 years old, had developed into a remarkably sophisticated child, who understood both the extraordinary privilege and terrible burden of her family's hidden legacy. She excelled in her studies at the parish school while secretly mastering skills that would enable her to continue protecting the Byzantine documents throughout her adult life. Her teachers praised her intelligence and dedication, having no idea that her true education was taking place during evening sessions, where her mother taught her to decode ancient ciphers and understand historical conspiracies that had shaped European politics for centuries. The first serious test of the family security arrangements came in 1897, when Serafina received word that European agents had finally traced her general location to the Boston area. Her enemies had systematically investigated immigration records and were now conducting detailed inquiries about Italian women who had arrived in the region during the early 1890s with educational backgrounds that matched Serafina's profile. The search was methodical and well-funded, suggesting that the powerful family she had fled continued to view her as a serious threat that required elimination. Serafina's response demonstrated the sophisticated understanding of security operations that she had developed during 6 years of protecting her family's secrets. Rather than attempting to flee Boston, which would have confirmed her enemies' suspicions about her location, she instead implemented a complex deception plan designed to convince them that she had died and that the Byzantine manuscripts had been destroyed. Working through trusted intermediaries in the Italian immigrant community, Serafina arranged for false documentation suggesting that she had succumbed to tuberculosis during the harsh winter of 1896-97. The deception included forged medical records, fabricated testimony from supposed witnesses to her illness, and even a staged funeral that was documented in local Italian-language newspapers. The false death was made more convincing by Caterina's apparent placement with a different Italian family under an assumed name, creating the impression that Serafina's daughter had been orphaned and absorbed into Boston's immigrant community. The elaborate deception required Serafina to essentially disappear from her established life while continuing to live secretly in Boston under a completely new identity. She found work as a private tutor for wealthy families, using forged credentials that established her as a widow from Florence rather than Venice. Her new identity allowed her to maintain financial independence while remaining invisible to the European agents who were searching for the Serafina Vespucci who had supposedly died of tuberculosis. Meanwhile, Caterina continued her education under her assumed name, living with a carefully chosen Italian family who believed they were providing charity to an orphaned girl while actually serving as unwitting protectors for the next generation of document guardians. The separation was emotionally devastating for both mother and daughter, but it provided essential security by ensuring that even if one of them was discovered by their enemies, the other might survive to continue protecting the Byzantine manuscripts. The deception proved successful when European surveillance operations in Boston were withdrawn in late 1898, apparently convinced that their target had died and that any documents she might have possessed had been lost or destroyed. But Serafina understood that her enemy's withdrawal might be temporary, and she spent the following years creating additional layers of security that would protect both the hidden manuscripts and the knowledge required to access them.
By 1900, Serafina had established what would become the permanent pattern for her family's protection of the Byzantine documents. She lived under an assumed identity that allowed her to maintain her scholarly work while remaining invisible to European enemies. Caterina, now 17 and living under her own assumed name, had developed into a brilliant young woman who possessed all the knowledge and skills necessary to continue protecting the family's secrets. Most importantly, both mother and daughter understood that their responsibility extended far beyond their own lifetimes. They were preserving priceless historical documents for future generations who might eventually be able to reveal their contents safely. The transition of responsibility from Serafina to Caterina began formally in 1903, when the daughter reached her 20th birthday and demonstrated her complete mastery of the complex security procedures that protected the hidden manuscripts. Serafina spent months taking Caterina through every aspect of the concealment system, from the symbolic meanings encoded in the mausoleum's carvings to the specific procedures required to access the hidden chambers without triggering the mechanical safeguards that would seal them permanently if handled incorrectly. More importantly, Serafina ensured that Caterina understood the historical and political context that made the documents so dangerous to certain European families. She provided detailed education about the specific noble houses that had orchestrated the betrayal of Constantinople, the modern descendants who continued to benefit from their ancestors' crimes, and the ongoing networks of influence that made these families capable of eliminating threats to their carefully constructed historical narratives. Caterina proved herself worthy of this trust by successfully accessing the hidden chambers during a carefully monitored test in 1904, demonstrating that she could not only locate and retrieve the Byzantine manuscripts, but also reseal them securely for continued protection. More significantly, she showed that she possessed the emotional discipline necessary to resist the temptation to reveal or study the documents inappropriately, understanding that any breach of security could bring deadly consequences for her family and potentially result in the destruction of irreplaceable historical artifacts.
The formal transfer of guardianship occurred in 1905, when Serafina provided Caterina with sealed letters containing complete instructions for accessing the hidden documents, detailed explanations of their historical significance, and comprehensive warnings about the ongoing dangers that would threaten anyone who possessed knowledge of their contents. The letters also contain specific instructions for training Caterina's own future children to continue the family's protective mission, ensuring that the knowledge would be passed safely to subsequent generations. Caterina's assumption of full responsibility for protecting the Byzantine documents coincided with her marriage to Giuseppe Benedetti in 1906, a union that had been carefully arranged to provide additional security for the family's secrets. Giuseppe was a successful businessman from Boston's Italian community who possessed both the financial resources and social connections that would be valuable for protecting Caterina and her future children. More importantly, he had demonstrated absolute loyalty and discretion in handling sensitive business matters, qualities that made him suitable for gradual introduction to certain aspects of his wife's extraordinary responsibilities. The marriage also provided cover for Caterina's continued access to the mausoleum at Mount Auburn Cemetery. As the wife of a prominent Italian-American businessman, she could visit her family's memorial without attracting attention while actually conducting the careful maintenance and security checks required to ensure the hidden documents remained safely concealed. Giuseppe understood that his wife's regular visits to her mother's grave were important for her emotional well-being, having no idea that she was actually maintaining one of the most sophisticated security systems of the early 20th century. Caterina's management of the family's protective mission during the first 2 decades of the new century demonstrated the strategic thinking and operational sophistication that she had inherited from her mother. She successfully navigated the challenges posed by increasing urbanization around Mount Auburn Cemetery, changing security technologies that might threaten the mausoleum's concealment systems, and periodic resurgence of European interest in locating documents that many people assumed had been lost or destroyed. Her most significant innovation was the establishment of what appeared to be a legitimate family business importing Italian art and antiquities, but which actually served as a cover for sophisticated intelligence operations designed to monitor European families who might pose ongoing threats to her security. Through carefully cultivated relationships with art dealers, academics, and collectors throughout Europe and America, Caterina maintained awareness of activities that might indicate renewed attempts to locate the Byzantine manuscripts or identify surviving members of the Vespucci family. The birth of Caterina's children, Elena in 1908 and Marco in 1911, required additional security measures to protect the next generation while preparing them for their eventual responsibilities. Caterina followed her mother's example by disguising essential training as cultural education, teaching her children about Italian history and traditions, while actually providing them with the knowledge and skills they would need to continue protecting the family's dangerous secrets.
Elena, like her mother and grandmother before her, demonstrated exceptional intellectual capabilities and emotional maturity that made her well-suited for inheriting the family's protective mission. By age 10, she could read Latin fluently and understand basic Greek, skills that her parents presented as preparation for possible academic careers while actually providing the linguistic foundation necessary to comprehend the Byzantine documents. More importantly, she had begun to understand the symbolic language encoded in the mausoleum's carvings, learning to recognize the historical references and iconographic elements that would eventually guide her to the hidden chambers. Marco, though younger, showed similar promise and received parallel training that would enable him to serve as backup guardian if anything happened to Elena. Caterina understood that the family's enemies possessed resources and patience that might threaten multiple generations, and she wanted to ensure that several family members would be capable of continuing the protective mission, even if some were eliminated or incapacitated. The outbreak of World War I in 1914 created new challenges and opportunities for the family's security operations.
European political upheavals offered potential cover for finally revealing the Byzantine documents, as the war had weakened or destroyed many of the noble families whose ancestors had orchestrated Constantinople's betrayal. But the conflict also created new dangers, as political instability might have encouraged desperate attempts to locate and exploit valuable historical artifacts that could be converted to funding for various war efforts. Caterina's response to these changing circumstances demonstrated the sophisticated strategic thinking that had become characteristic of the Vespucci family's approach to protecting their secrets. Rather than taking advantage of wartime confusion to reveal the documents prematurely, she instead used the period to strengthen her security arrangements while positioning her family to take advantage of post-war opportunities for safe disclosure. Working through her import business's European connections, she gathered detailed intelligence about the fate of specific noble families, whose historical crimes were documented in the Byzantine manuscripts. Several houses had lost significant power and influence due to war casualties and political changes, potentially reducing their ability to retaliate about revelations about their ancestors' betrayal of Constantinople. But other families had actually strengthened their positions by providing financial support to various war efforts, suggesting they retained resources that could threaten anyone who challenged their historical narratives. By 1918, as the war concluded, Caterina had established her family as successful Italian-American business people, whose import operations provided both financial security and international connections that would be valuable for protecting future generations. Her children were receiving excellent educations that prepared them for legitimate careers while secretly providing training in languages, history, and security procedures that would enable them to continue the family's protective mission. Most importantly, she had successfully maintained perfect security around the Byzantine documents throughout a period of unprecedented global upheaval, ensuring priceless historical artifacts remained safely hidden while political circumstances evolved toward conditions that might eventually allow their contents to be revealed without triggering deadly retaliation from the powerful families whose ancestors had committed the crimes they documented. The 1920s brought new prosperity to the Benedetti family as Giuseppe's business operations expanded throughout New England and established profitable connections with Italian suppliers who had been disrupted by wartime conditions. This financial success provided additional resources for maintaining security around the Byzantine documents, while creating legitimate reasons for family members to travel internationally, gathering intelligence about ongoing threats and opportunities. Alina, now in her teens, had developed into a remarkably capable young woman who demonstrated all the qualities necessary to become the next guardian of the family's secrets. Her academic achievements earned admission to Radcliffe College, where she studied classical languages and ancient history while maintaining the cover that her interest in Byzantine civilization was purely scholarly, rather than connected to priceless documents hidden in her family's mausoleum. The decade concluded with Caterina's decision to begin the gradual transition of responsibility to Alina, recognizing that the next generation would need to be fully prepared for guardianship duties that might extend well into the remainder of the 20th century. The elaborate training process, which had begun when Alina was a child, intensified as she demonstrated her complete mastery of the knowledge and skills required to protect documents that had already survived nearly 40 years of concealment in America, while remaining hidden from enemies whose descendants continued to pose deadly threats to anyone who possessed them.
Elena Benedetti Morrison assumed full guardianship of the family's Byzantine treasure in 1934, inheriting not only the responsibility for protecting $600 million worth of ancient artifacts, but also the most sophisticated private intelligence network in New England. At 26, she had completed her doctoral dissertation on economic networks in late Byzantine Constantinople at Radcliffe College, a work that impressed her professors with its unprecedented insights into 15th century Mediterranean trade relationships, while carefully avoiding any mention of the original imperial documents that had made her research possible.
Her marriage to James Morrison in 1932 had been as strategically calculated as it was romantically fulfilling. James was a successful attorney from a prominent Boston family whose legal expertise and social connections provided perfect cover for Elena's continuing intelligence operations. More importantly, his law firm's international clients included several European banking houses and art collectors, providing Elena with legitimate reasons to maintain contact with continental networks that might reveal renewed interest in locating the Byzantine manuscripts that her family had protected for over 4 decades. The Morrison name gave Elena access to Boston's highest social circles, where conversations at charity galas and cultural events often revealed more about European political developments than formal intelligence reports. As Mrs. James Morrison, she could attend embassy receptions, university symposiums, and private collector gatherings where wealthy Americans and visiting Europeans discussed art acquisitions, historical research, and family genealogies that might indicate whether certain noble houses continued to pose threats to anyone possessing knowledge of their ancestors' crimes. Elena's public persona as a scholar socialite masked operational capabilities that would have impressed professional intelligence services. Her Park Square townhouse contained a private library that appeared to focus on legitimate Byzantine studies, but actually served as the command center for monitoring activities across 2 continents. She maintained correspondence with academics, collectors, dealers, and private researchers throughout Europe and America, creating an information network that could detect even subtle indications of renewed interest in the specific documents her family possessed. The sophistication of Elena's operations became evident during the 1930s, when rising political tensions in Europe created both new dangers and unprecedented opportunities for finally revealing the Byzantine treasure. The economic instability that preceded World War II had weakened several of the noble families whose ancestors were implicated in the Constantinople betrayal, potentially reducing their ability to retaliate against historical revelations. Simultaneously, the growth of professional archaeology and museum systems had created legitimate institutions capable of properly preserving and studying ancient manuscripts that had been hidden for centuries. But Elena recognized that premature disclosure could still bring deadly consequences for her family. The same political upheavals that had weakened some traditional power structures had strengthened others, and fascist movements throughout Europe were actively seeking historical justifications for their territorial ambitions and racial theories. Documents proving that certain noble families had actually been traitors and collaborators might be welcomed by some political factions while triggering violent responses from others. Elena's response demonstrated the strategic patience that had characterized her family's approach to protecting their dangerous secrets. Rather than rushing to capitalize on changing European conditions, she used the period to strengthen her intelligence capabilities while positioning her family to take advantage of post-war opportunities that might finally allow safe disclosure of the Byzantine documents. Working through her husband's legal connections and her own academic relationships, Elena established what appeared to be a private foundation supporting historical research and cultural preservation. The Morrison Foundation for Byzantine Studies provided grants to scholars throughout America and Europe, creating legitimate reasons for Elena to correspond with researchers who might encounter references to the specific documents her family possessed. More importantly, the Foundation's activities allowed her to identify academics who could eventually be trusted with revelations about the hidden manuscripts. The Foundation's public activities focused on supporting traditional scholarship about the late Byzantine Empire, but its private intelligence operations were far more sophisticated. Elena maintained detailed files on dozens of European families whose genealogies connected them to the 15th century betrayal of Constantinople. She tracked marriages, business relationships, political appointments, and financial developments that might indicate whether these families retained resources that could threaten anyone challenging their historical narratives.
Most significantly, Elena used the Foundation's resources to commission genealogical research that mapped the modern descendants of families implicated in the Byzantine documents. This research, disguised as academic interest in medieval European networks, actually served as threat assessment for planning eventual disclosure of the manuscripts. Elena needed to understand exactly which contemporary individuals might be motivated to suppress revelations about their ancestors' crimes and whether they possessed capabilities that could endanger her family.
Elena Benedetti Morrison assumed full guardianship of the family's Byzantine treasure in 1934, inheriting not only the responsibility for protecting $600 million worth of ancient artifacts, but also the most sophisticated private intelligence network in New England. At 26, she had completed her doctoral dissertation on economic networks in late Byzantine Constantinople at Radcliffe College, a work that impressed her professors with its unprecedented insights into 15th-century Mediterranean trade relationships, while carefully avoiding any mention of the original imperial documents that had made her research possible. Her marriage to James Morrison in 1932 had been as strategically calculated as it was romantically fulfilling. James was a successful attorney from a prominent Boston family whose legal expertise and social connections provided perfect cover for Elena's continuing intelligence operations. More importantly, his law firm's international clients included several European banking houses and art collectors, providing Elena with legitimate reasons to maintain contact with continental networks that might reveal renewed interest in locating the Byzantine manuscripts that her family had protected for over 4 decades. The Morrison name gave Elena access to Boston's highest social circles, where conversations at charity galas and cultural events often revealed more about European political developments than formal intelligence reports. As Mrs. James Morrison, she could attend embassy receptions, university symposiums, and private collector gatherings where wealthy Americans and visiting Europeans discussed art acquisitions, historical research, and family genealogies that might indicate whether certain noble houses continued to pose threats to anyone possessing knowledge of their ancestors' crimes. Elena's public persona as a scholar socialite masked operational capabilities that would have impressed professional intelligence services. Her Park Square townhouse contained a private library that appeared to focus on legitimate Byzantine studies, but actually served as the command center for monitoring activities across 2 continents. She maintained correspondence with academics, collectors, dealers, and private researchers throughout Europe and America, creating an information network that could detect even subtle indications of renewed interest in the specific documents her family possessed. The sophistication of Elena's operations became evident during the 1930s, when rising political tensions in Europe created both new dangers and unprecedented opportunities for finally revealing the Byzantine treasure. The economic instability that preceded World War II had weakened several of the noble families whose ancestors were implicated in the Constantinople betrayal, potentially reducing their ability to retaliate against historical revelations. Simultaneously, the growth of professional archaeology and museum systems had created legitimate institutions capable of properly preserving and studying ancient manuscripts that had been hidden for centuries. But Elena recognized that premature disclosure could still bring deadly consequences for her family. The same political upheavals that had weakened some traditional power structures had strengthened others, and fascist movements throughout Europe were actively seeking historical justifications for their territorial ambitions and racial theories. Documents proving that certain noble families had actually been traitors and collaborators might be welcomed by some political factions while triggering violent responses from others. Elena's response demonstrated the strategic patience that had characterized her family's approach to protecting their dangerous secrets.
Rather than rushing to capitalize on changing European conditions, she used the period to strengthen her intelligence capabilities while positioning her family to take advantage of post-war opportunities that might finally allow safe disclosure of the Byzantine documents. Working through her husband's legal connections and her own academic relationships, Elena established what appeared to be a private foundation supporting historical research and cultural preservation. The Morrison Foundation for Byzantine Studies provided grants to scholars throughout America and Europe, creating legitimate reasons for Elena to correspond with researchers who might encounter references to the specific documents her family possessed. More importantly, the Foundation's activities allowed her to identify academics who could eventually be trusted with revelations about the hidden manuscripts. The Foundation's public activities focused on supporting traditional scholarship about the late Byzantine Empire, but its private intelligence operations were far more sophisticated. Elena maintained detailed files on dozens of European families whose genealogies connected them to the 15th century betrayal of Constantinople. She tracked marriages, business relationships, political appointments, and financial developments that might indicate whether these families retained resources that could threaten anyone challenging their historical narratives. Most significantly, Elena used the Foundation's resources to commission genealogical research that mapped the modern descendants of families implicated in the Byzantine documents. This research, disguised as academic interest in medieval European networks, actually served as threat assessment for planning eventual disclosure of the manuscripts. Elena needed to understand exactly which contemporary individuals might be motivated to suppress revelations about their ancestors' crimes and whether they possessed capabilities that could endanger her family.
The outbreak of World War II in 1939 validated Elena's cautious approach to protecting the family's secrets. Political chaos throughout Europe created opportunities for various factions to exploit historical documents for propaganda purposes, while simultaneously making it nearly impossible to predict which revelations might trigger violent retaliation from desperate survivors of collapsed regimes. Elena recognized that wartime conditions were too unpredictable for safe disclosure of manuscripts that could reshape understanding of European political development. Instead, she used the war years to expand her intelligence operations while positioning her family for post-conflict opportunities. The Morrison Foundation increased its support for refugee scholars who had fled European universities, creating relationships with academics who possess detailed knowledge of continental political networks and family histories. These refugee connections provided Elena with unprecedented insight into which European noble houses had actually collaborated with fascist movements and which had genuinely opposed them. More importantly, Elena used wartime disruptions to conduct the most comprehensive security review of the mausoleum concealment system since her grandmother had originally installed it 50 years earlier. Working with her brother Marco, who had developed expertise in mechanical engineering, she upgraded the physical safeguards protecting the hidden chambers while improving the environmental controls that preserved the ancient manuscripts from deterioration. The security improvements reflected both advancing technology and Elena's recognition that post-war conditions might bring new types of threats to the family's treasure. International intelligence services were becoming more sophisticated, and the growing importance of historical propaganda in modern political conflicts meant that various governments might eventually develop interest in documents that could embarrass traditional allies or justify territorial claims. Elena's most significant innovation was the creation of multiple backup copies of the most crucial Byzantine manuscripts, using photographic techniques that had been developed for wartime intelligence operations. These copies were concealed in separate locations throughout New England, ensuring that even if the mausoleum were discovered and penetrated, essential historical evidence would survive for future disclosure. The backup locations were chosen and prepared with the same careful attention to security and preservation that characterized all Elena's protective measures.
By 1945, as the war concluded, Elena had transformed her family's protective mission from simple concealment into a comprehensive intelligence operation capable of monitoring global developments that might affect the safety of revealing the Byzantine treasure. Her network of academic contacts, legal connections, and cultural relationships provided early warning about renewed European interest in locating documents that many people had forgotten or assumed destroyed. The post-war years brought unprecedented prosperity to the Morrison family, as James's legal practice expanded to serve American corporations investing in European reconstruction, while Elena's foundation became recognized as a leading supporter of Byzantine studies throughout the academic world. This financial success provided resources for maintaining elaborate security measures while creating additional cover for Elena's intelligence activities. More significantly, changing political conditions in post-war Europe suggested that the time might finally be approaching when the Byzantine documents could be safely revealed. Several of the noble families whose ancestors were implicated in the Constantinople betrayal had lost power and influence during the war, while growing academic interest in medieval studies had created institutions capable of properly studying and preserving ancient manuscripts that had been hidden for centuries. Elena began preliminary planning for eventual disclosure during the late 1940s, working with her most trusted academic contacts to identify scholars who possessed both the expertise to authenticate the Byzantine documents and the integrity to handle revelations that could reshape understanding of European history. This planning required extraordinary discretion, as premature disclosure could still bring deadly consequences, while failure to prepare properly might result in the manuscripts being dismissed as forgeries or mishandled by unprepared institutions. The birth of Elena's children, Catherine in 1946 and Robert in 1949, required modifications to the family's protective arrangements, while ensuring that the fourth generation would be prepared for responsibilities that might extend well into the 21st century. Elena followed the pattern established by her mother and grandmother, disguising essential training as cultural education while gradually introducing her children to the extraordinary secrets that defined their family's mission. Catherine, like the women who had preceded her, demonstrated exceptional intellectual capabilities and emotional maturity that made her well-suited for inheriting guardianship responsibilities. By age 5, she was already learning Latin phrases that her mother presented as Italian cultural traditions, while actually providing linguistic foundation for eventually understanding the Byzantine manuscripts. Her education emphasized languages, history, and analytical thinking that would be essential for continuing the family's protective mission.
Robert received parallel training that would enable him to serve as backup guardian and provide operational support for his sister's eventual leadership of the family's treasure protection activities. Elena understood that modern conditions might require more sophisticated security measures than previous generations had needed, and she wanted both children to develop capabilities that would be valuable for 20th century challenges. The 1950s marked the peak of Elena's success in balancing public prominence with secret operations. The Morrison Foundation had become one of America's most respected supporters of historical research, while Elena's social position provided access to information networks that spanned both sides of the Atlantic. Her scholarly reputation earned invitations to conferences and symposiums where she could monitor European academic developments while maintaining perfect cover for her intelligence activities. Most importantly, Elena had successfully modernized her family's protective mission without compromising the security that had kept the Byzantine treasure hidden for over 60 years.
Her intelligence operations provided early warning about potential threats, while her academic connections created opportunities for eventual safe disclosure of documents that could revolutionize understanding of medieval European history. The Foundation's annual reports during this period reflected Elena's growing confidence that conditions were evolving toward eventual revelation of the family's treasure. Grants to scholars throughout America and Europe were producing research that provided historical context for the Byzantine documents, while political developments had weakened or eliminated many of the families whose descendants might have retaliated against disclosures about their ancestors' crimes. Elena's most significant achievement during the 1950s was establishing relationships with museum professionals and conservation specialists who would be capable of properly handling ancient manuscripts that had been preserved under unusual conditions for extended periods. These relationships, developed through the Foundation's legitimate support for cultural preservation, would be essential when the time came to reveal documents that required immediate professional attention to ensure their continued survival. By 1960, Elena had positioned her family for eventual disclosure of the Byzantine treasure, while maintaining perfect security around secrets that had been protected for nearly 70 years. Her children were receiving education that prepared them for both legitimate careers and continuation of the family's protective mission, while her intelligence networks provided comprehensive awareness of global developments that might affect the safety of revealing priceless historical documents. The decade of the 1960s brought both new opportunities and unprecedented challenges for Elena's management of the family's treasure protection mission. Social and political upheavals throughout America and Europe created conditions that might finally allow safe disclosure of the Byzantine documents, while simultaneously generating new types of threats that required updated security measures and operational procedures. Student movements and anti-establishment sentiment created academic environments more receptive to historical revelations that challenged traditional narratives about European development. Younger scholars were particularly interested in research that exposed the hypocrisies and crimes of established power structures, suggesting they might welcome documents proving that certain noble families had actually been traitors and collaborators. Simultaneously, the growth of international tourism and cultural exchange programs had made it easier for Elena to monitor European developments while maintaining legitimate reasons for travel and correspondence with continental contacts. The Morrison Foundation's expanding activities provided perfect cover for intelligence gathering that would have been impossible during earlier decades when international communication was more limited and closely monitored. But the same social changes that created opportunities for disclosure also generated new security challenges. Intelligence services throughout the world were becoming more sophisticated in their methods for locating and exploiting historical documents that could serve propaganda purposes. The Cold War had intensified interest in any materials that could embarrass Western allies or justify territorial claims, while growing terrorist activities demonstrated that non-governmental organizations might also pose threats to families possessing valuable secrets. Elena's response to these changing conditions demonstrated the sophisticated strategic thinking that had characterized her family's approach to protecting their treasure for over 7 decades. Rather than rushing to take advantage of seemingly favorable academic conditions, she intensified her intelligence operations while strengthening security measures that protected both the Byzantine documents and the knowledge required to access them. Working through the Foundation's expanded network of academic and cultural contacts, Elena commissioned comprehensive studies of political developments throughout Europe that might affect the safety of historical disclosures. This research, disguised as scholarly interest in post-war social changes,
actually served as threat assessment for planning eventual revelation of manuscripts that could trigger unpredictable reactions from various governmental and private organizations.
Most significantly, Elena began preparing detailed contingency plans for different scenarios that might develop during disclosure of the Byzantine treasure. These plans addressed everything from academic authentication procedures to security measures that would protect her family from retaliation by descendants of the families implicated in the documents. The planning process required Elena to anticipate challenges that no previous generation of guardians had needed to consider, as changing global conditions had created both opportunities and dangers that were unprecedented in the family's experience. By the end of the 1960s, Elena had successfully adapted her family's protective mission to modern conditions, while maintaining perfect security around treasure that was approaching its 80th year of concealment in America. Her children were completing educations that prepared them for assumption of guardianship responsibilities, while her intelligence networks provided comprehensive monitoring of global developments that would affect timing and methods for eventual safe disclosure of priceless historical documents that could transform understanding of medieval European civilization. The approach of the 1970s brought Elena to a crucial decision point that would determine whether her generation would finally reveal the Byzantine treasure or continue the protective mission for another generation. Changing political and academic conditions suggested that opportunities for safe disclosure might be reaching optimal levels, while her advancing age made it essential to complete the transition of responsibilities to Catherine and Robert before Elena became unable to provide guidance for the complex process of revealing secrets that had been hidden for nearly 8 decades. By 1973, I had successfully inherited the full scope of my mother Elena's responsibilities as guardian of our family's Byzantine treasure. At 27, I was Dr. Catherine Morrison Castellano, having completed my doctorate in medieval history at Harvard, while secretly using the hidden documents to produce groundbreaking research that earned me international recognition as one of the world's leading experts on late Byzantine civilization. My marriage to Professor Antonio Castellano in 1971 had united 2 distinguished academic families, creating the perfect cover for intelligence operations that spanned both sides of the Atlantic. Antonio, a specialist in Renaissance Italian politics from Columbia University, brought not only genuine love and intellectual partnership to our marriage, but also crucial contacts throughout European academic institutions. His research on Venetian political networks during the 15th and 16th centuries complemented my Byzantine studies perfectly, providing legitimate reasons for extensive correspondence with scholars and archivists who might encounter references to the specific manuscripts our family had protected for over 80 years. Our combined scholarly reputation had elevated the Morrison Foundation for Byzantine Studies to unprecedented prominence within international academic circles. By the early 1970s, we were funding research projects in 12 countries, hosting annual symposiums that attracted the world's leading medievalists and maintaining correspondence with virtually every major library and museum collection that contained Byzantine materials. This vast network provided comprehensive intelligence about any renewed interest in the documents we possessed, while positioning us to eventually reveal their contents through proper scholarly channels. The Foundation's success had also generated substantial financial resources that strengthened our family's security arrangements, while providing funding for increasingly sophisticated preservation and protection measures. Our Beacon Hill townhouse had been renovated to include climate-controlled storage facilities and advanced security systems, while the mausoleum at Mount Auburn Cemetery had been upgraded with environmental monitoring equipment disguised as standard memorial maintenance. Most importantly, I had successfully completed the transition from student to master of the complex skills required for protecting our dangerous secrets. My intelligence networks provided comprehensive monitoring of European political and academic developments. My scholarly credentials offered perfect cover for sensitive research activities, and my understanding of the Byzantine documents' contents allowed me to anticipate challenges and opportunities that less informed guardians might have missed. The first indication that our 80-year run of perfect security was about to face its greatest challenge came in March 1973, when I received a letter from Dr. Heinrich Zimmermann, a prominent German medievalist whom I had never met, but whose reputation for aggressive scholarship and questionable research methods had made him notorious throughout academic circles. Dr. Zimmermann's letter, written on elegant university stationery from Munich, expressed interest in corresponding about certain recently discovered references to Byzantine imperial documents that may have survived the fall of Constantinople. The letter's language was carefully neutral, but several details immediately triggered alarm bells based on the security protocols my family had developed over decades of protecting our secrets. Zimmermann's inquiry mentioned specific details about the content and provenance of Byzantine imperial chronicles that matched exactly the documents hidden in our mausoleum. More disturbing, he referenced recent discoveries in Venetian family archives that had revealed information about document preservation activities during the late 15th century.
Working through the Foundation's European contacts, I quickly gathered intelligence about Dr. Zimmermann's background and recent research activities. What I discovered was deeply troubling. Zimmermann was not simply an academic researcher pursuing normal scholarly inquiries. He was connected to several wealthy German families whose genealogies traced back to medieval merchant houses, and his recent publications had focused suspiciously on recovering lost historical narratives that could enhance certain families' reputations for supporting Christian causes during the late medieval period. More ominously, Zimmermann had been conducting extensive research in Venice during 1972, working with private family archives that were normally closed to outside scholars. His access to these restricted collections suggested he possessed either substantial financial resources or powerful political connections that enabled him to examine documents that most researchers would never see. The timing of his inquiries, coming just months after his Venice research, strongly suggested he had discovered references to these specific documents our family possessed. My investigation revealed that Zimmermann's research was being funded by the Weiss Foundation, a private German organization that claimed to support historical research but actually served as a front for activities designed to rehabilitate the reputations of certain European families whose ancestors had been involved in questionable activities during various historical periods. The Weiss Foundation's board included members of several noble houses whose genealogies connected them directly to families implicated in the Byzantine documents hidden in our mausoleum. The implications were staggering. After 80 years of perfect security, our family's greatest fears were being realized. Descendants of the very families who had orchestrated the betrayal of Constantinople were actively searching for documents that could prove their ancestors' crimes. Worse still, they possessed resources and capabilities that far exceeded anything our ancestors had faced when they first fled European persecution in 1891. Dr. Zimmermann's initial letter was followed by increasingly persistent correspondence throughout the spring and summer of 1973.
His subsequent inquiries became more specific and more threatening, referencing details about certain American academic families who might possess documents that belonged rightfully to European institutions. He mentioned the Morrison Foundation by name, suggesting that our prominence in Byzantine studies made us likely candidates for possessing materials that had been inappropriately removed from their original European context. Each letter demonstrated knowledge that could only have come from extensive intelligence gathering about our family's background and activities. Zimmerman knew details about my mother Elena's research interests, my own academic specializations, and even specific publications we had funded through the foundation. Most alarmingly, he possessed information about our family's genealogy that connected us to certain Italian refugees who had arrived in Boston during the 1890s, carrying undocumented historical materials. By August 1973, it had become clear that Zimmerman's inquiries were not isolated academic interest, but part of a coordinated campaign by multiple European organizations to locate and recover the Byzantine documents. Intelligence gathered through our academic networks revealed that similar inquiries were being made to scholars and institutions throughout America and Europe, all focusing on materials that had supposedly been removed from Venice during the late 19th century. The scope and sophistication of this search operation indicated that our enemies possessed resources that dwarfed anything our family had previously encountered. They had access to genealogical research capabilities that could trace family connections across multiple generations and countries. They maintained networks within major libraries and archives that provided information about researchers and collections. Most threateningly, they demonstrated knowledge of our family's protective mission that could only have come from sources in the very academic and cultural institutions we had relied upon for cover. The escalation continued in September 1973 when Dr. Zimmerman arrived in Boston for what he claimed was a routine academic visit to Harvard and other local universities. His presence in our city was obviously intended as intimidation, a demonstration that European interests possessed resources for international operations and were prepared to bring pressure directly to bear on American families who possessed materials they wanted to recover. Through carefully maintained surveillance, conducted with assistance from private security professionals whom Antonio had contacted through his legal connections, we learned that Zimmerman's activities in Boston extended far beyond academic visits. He was systematically investigating our family's background, interviewing longtime residents of our neighborhood, examining public records related to our property holdings, and even conducting reconnaissance of Mount Auburn Cemetery, where our mausoleum was located. Most alarmingly, he had made contact with several European art dealers and antiquities collectors who operated in Boston, inquiring about opportunities to recover important cultural materials that had been inappropriately exported from Europe during previous periods of political instability.
The crisis deepened in October 1973 when we discovered that Zimmerman's intelligence gathering had extended to our domestic staff and business associates. Several employees of the Morrison Foundation reported being approached by well-dressed Europeans who claimed to be journalists researching academic families, but who asked suspicious questions about our research activities, travel patterns, and personal routines. The inquiries were professionally conducted, but clearly designed to gather operational intelligence rather than biographical information. More threateningly, we learned that similar approaches were being made to our children's teachers and the staff at various institutions where Catherine and Robert were enrolled in educational programs. The Europeans were obviously conducting comprehensive surveillance of our entire family, gathering information that could be used to pressure us or potentially target our children if we refused to cooperate with their demands. The psychological pressure of living under constant surveillance while maintaining the facade of normal academic life was enormous. Every conversation, every meeting, every routine activity had to be conducted with awareness that hostile observers might be monitoring our behavior for signs of the secrets we were protecting.
The scholarly work that had provided perfect cover for our protective mission now felt dangerous, as academic conferences and professional correspondence might expose us to additional scrutiny from enemies who possessed detailed knowledge of our research interests. Antonio, despite his intellectual understanding of the historical significance of our family's mission, struggled with the reality of being married to someone whose ancestors' actions had placed our entire family in mortal danger. He had accepted the responsibility of helping to protect the Byzantine documents, but the stress of constant vigilance while maintaining our professional obligations was affecting his own research and his relationships with colleagues who had no idea why he had become increasingly cautious and secretive. The situation reached a critical point in November 1973 when Dr. Zimmerman made direct contact with me, requesting a private meeting to discuss matters of mutual interest regarding certain historical materials. His message, delivered through intermediaries connected to Harvard's Medieval Studies Department, was courteously worded but contained unmistakable threats about unfortunate consequences that might befall academic families who possessed documents that belonged in European collections. The meeting request forced us to confront the reality that our 80-year run of successful concealment was ending. We could no longer simply ignore or evade European pressure through the intelligence and security measures that had protected previous generations. Dr. Zimmerman and his associates possessed resources and capabilities that required us to either capitulate to their demands or escalate our resistance to levels that might bring violent confrontation. More immediately, we faced practical decisions about protecting our children and ensuring the survival of the Byzantine documents, even if our family was eliminated or forced to abandon our protective mission. The security arrangements that had seemed adequate for protecting secrets from casual discovery were obviously insufficient against professional intelligence operations conducted by enemies with unlimited resources and international reach. Working through Antonio's legal connections, we began exploring options for transferring the Byzantine documents to major academic or cultural institutions that possessed security capabilities and political influence that might deter retaliation from European families. But such transfers would require revealing secrets that had been protected for over 80 decades, potentially triggering exactly the violent responses that our ancestors had feared when they first concealed the documents. The dilemma was excruciating. Continuing to protect the secrets independently might result in their discovery and seizure by enemies who would certainly destroy evidence of their ancestors' crimes. But revealing the documents prematurely might expose our family to retaliation while potentially resulting in the manuscripts being dismissed as forgeries or inadequately protected by institutions that didn't understand their historical significance or the dangers they represented. As winter approached in 1973, we were living under siege conditions while attempting to maintain the appearance of normal academic life. Private security measures had been implemented to protect our home and monitor surveillance activities, but we understood that such precautions could only delay rather than prevent determined enemies from eventually achieving their objectives. The stress was affecting every aspect of our lives. My scholarly work, which had always been my greatest passion and the perfect cover for our family's mission, now felt dangerous and exposed. Academic conferences that had once been opportunities for building intelligence networks now seemed like venues where hostile observers could gather additional information about our activities and associations. Most painfully, our children were beginning to sense that something was seriously wrong with our family situation. Catherine, now 11 years old, had started asking why strange men were sometimes watching our house, and why her parents had become so cautious about traveling or meeting with unfamiliar people. Robert, at 8, was too young to understand the specifics, but was clearly responding to the tension and anxiety that had begun to dominate our household. The realization that our protective mission was endangering our children's safety and normal development forced us to confront possibilities that previous generations had never needed to consider. We might need to abandon the scholarly careers that had provided perfect cover for our activities, relocate our family to new identities in different parts of the country, or even consider revealing the Byzantine documents under circumstances that offered less protection than we had hoped to achieve. By December 1973, the pressure had become nearly unbearable. Dr. Zimmerman's presence in Boston had attracted additional European agents who were conducting increasingly aggressive surveillance and intelligence gathering. Our academic colleagues were beginning to notice our changed behavior and increased security precautions, potentially compromising the scholarly reputations that had been essential for our protective activities. Most critically, we had received indications that the Europeans were preparing to escalate their campaign beyond surveillance and intimidation to more direct action. Intelligence gathered through our security consultants suggested that plans were being developed for operations designed to force us to surrender the Byzantine documents through methods that might include threats against our children or attempts to seize the materials through coordinated raids on our properties. The crisis that had begun with a seemingly innocent academic inquiry had evolved into an existential threat to our family and the priceless historical documents we had protected for over 8 decades. The security measures and intelligence capabilities that had seemed sophisticated and comprehensive were proving inadequate against enemies whose resources and determination exceeded anything our ancestors had anticipated when they first concealed the Byzantine treasure in America. As 1973 concluded, we faced the possibility that we might become the generation that either successfully revealed the documents under secure conditions or lost them entirely to enemies whose ancestors had already committed multiple murders to protect the historical secrets that the manuscripts contained. The weight of 80 years of family sacrifice and 4 generations of careful preparation rested on decisions we would need to make in the coming months, decisions that would determine whether Serafina's desperate gamble in fleeing Venice had ultimately succeeded or failed. The breaking point came on January 15, 1974, when our 8-year-old son Robert disappeared on his way home from school. The carefully orchestrated kidnapping was a masterpiece of psychological warfare designed to force us into immediate compliance with European demands, while demonstrating that our enemies possessed capabilities that made resistance futile. Robert vanished during the 6-block walk from his elementary school to our Beacon Hill townhouse, a route he had traveled safely hundreds of times under the discreet protection of security personnel we had hired to monitor our children's activities. The kidnapping was accomplished so professionally that none of our surveillance teams detected any suspicious activity, and Robert simply failed to arrive home at his usual time without any witnesses to his disappearance. The message arrived 3 hours later, delivered by a well-dressed courier who handed it directly to me at our front door before disappearing into the Boston evening. The envelope contained a single photograph showing Robert sitting in what appeared to be a comfortable room, reading a book and looking unharmed, but obviously confused about his circumstances. The accompanying note, written in elegant script on expensive paper, was brief and terrifyingly direct. Dr. Castellano, your son is safe and comfortable. He will remain so as long as you demonstrate reasonable cooperation regarding certain historical materials. You have 48 hours to contact Dr. Zimmerman to arrange transfer of documents that belong in European collections. Any attempt to involve authorities will result in permanent separation from your child. Antonio's reaction was immediate and devastating. Despite his intellectual understanding of our family's mission and his acceptance of the risks involved in protecting the Byzantine treasure,
The reality of seeing his son used as leverage by ruthless enemies shattered his emotional equilibrium. He demanded that we surrender the documents immediately, arguing that no historical artifacts, regardless of their significance, were worth endangering Robert's life. "Catherine, they have our son," he said, his voice breaking with anguish and fury. "Whatever your ancestors died to protect, whatever secrets these documents contain, none of it matters if we lose Robert. We have to give them what they want." I understood his desperation, but I also recognized that surrendering the documents would not guarantee Robert's safe return. The European families who had orchestrated this kidnapping were the same people whose ancestors had committed multiple murders in Venice during 1891 to suppress the evidence that the Byzantine manuscripts contained. They had demonstrated over centuries that they would eliminate anyone who possessed knowledge that could expose their historical crimes. More critically, I realized that the kidnapping represented an opportunity as well as a crisis. Dr. Zimmerman and his associates had revealed themselves through this desperate action, abandoning the careful discretion that had protected them during months of surveillance and intelligence gathering. Their willingness to commit a felony on American soil suggested they were operating under pressure from European superiors who demanded immediate results regardless of the risks involved.
Working through contacts in Antonio's law firm, I immediately began implementing contingency plans that my family had developed over decades of preparing for exactly this type of crisis. While maintaining the appearance of desperate parents willing to cooperate with kidnappers' demands, we actually launched a sophisticated counterintelligence operation designed to turn the tables on enemies who had finally exposed themselves to retaliation. The first element of our response involved contacting Dr. Marcus Blackwood, a former intelligence analyst who had transitioned to academic consulting and whom we had identified years earlier as someone who possessed both the security expertise and historical knowledge that would be essential for safely revealing the Byzantine documents. Dr. Blackwood had been conducting research into Cold War intelligence operations involving cultural artifacts, and his background made him uniquely qualified to understand both the historical significance of our treasure and the modern dangers it represented. Dr. Blackwood's initial assessment of our situation was grimly realistic. "Dr. Castellano," he explained during an emergency meeting at his secure Cambridge office, "you're dealing with people who have maintained operational capabilities across multiple generations and international boundaries. The kidnapping demonstrates they're prepared to use violence, but it also reveals they're operating under external pressure that makes them vulnerable to countermeasures." His analysis of the kidnapping revealed sophisticated planning that confirmed our worst fears about our enemy's capabilities while also identifying weaknesses we could exploit. The operation had required coordination between European intelligence assets and American operatives, communication systems that could be monitored and potentially penetrated, and logistical arrangements that created opportunities for law enforcement intervention if properly managed. Most importantly, Dr. Blackwood confirmed that the European families behind the kidnapping were themselves vulnerable to exposure of their activities. Modern intelligence services and law enforcement agencies possessed capabilities that could identify and prosecute criminal operations, while academic and cultural institutions had developed protective systems that could safeguard historical documents against both theft and suppression. "The documents your family has protected represent more than historical artifacts. They're evidence of crimes that implicate families who continue to hold significant political and economic power throughout Europe. But that same power makes them vulnerable to scandal and legal prosecution if their activities become public knowledge through proper channels." Working with Dr. Blackwood's guidance, we developed a comprehensive plan for simultaneously rescuing Robert and revealing the Byzantine treasure under circumstances that would protect both our family and the historical documents from future threats. The first phase involved establishing contact with Dr. Zimmerman, while secretly coordinating with federal law enforcement agencies that possessed jurisdiction over international kidnapping and cultural trafficking crimes.
Through Antonio's legal connections, we arranged for FBI involvement under the pretense of reporting Robert's disappearance while actually providing information that would enable authorities to identify and monitor the European criminal network that had taken our son. The FBI's response exceeded our expectations. Special Agent Diana Chen, who specialized in international art crimes and cultural trafficking, immediately recognized our case connected to ongoing investigations involving European families who had been suspected of using intimidation and violence to suppress historical research that threatened their reputations. Dr. Castellano, Agent Chen explained during our initial briefing, your family's situation fits a pattern we've been investigating for several years. These European organizations operate like intelligence services, using sophisticated methods to locate and eliminate threats to certain families' historical narratives, but they finally made a mistake by operating directly on American soil. The FBI's involvement provided both protective resources and investigative capabilities that transformed our desperate situation into an opportunity for comprehensive resolution of threats that had menaced our family for over 80 years. Federal agents began monitoring communication systems that connected Dr. Zimmerman to his superiors, while international cooperation agreements enabled investigation of the criminal networks that had been conducting surveillance and intimidation campaigns against American families. Meanwhile, Dr. Blackwood had begun assembling an international consortium of museums, universities, and cultural preservation organizations that would be capable of properly studying and protecting the Byzantine documents once they were revealed. This consortium included institutions with sufficient security capabilities and political influence to deter retaliation from European families, while possessing scholarly expertise necessary to authenticate and interpret manuscripts that could revolutionize understanding of medieval European history.
The second phase of our plan involved arranging a meeting with Dr. Zimmerman under circumstances that would enable law enforcement surveillance while creating opportunities to gather evidence about the broader European operation. Working through Harvard's Medieval Studies Department, I agreed to meet Dr. Zimmerman at the university's Widener Library, a public location that provided security for our family while allowing federal agents to monitor the encounter. The meeting, scheduled for January 18, 1974, was intended to appear as capitulation to kidnapping demands while actually serving as the final stage of a counterintelligence operation designed to expose and eliminate threats that had menaced 4 generations of our family. Dr. Zimmerman's response to our apparent surrender would provide crucial evidence about his associates' intentions while enabling law enforcement agencies to identify and apprehend the criminal network that had kidnapped Robert. Dr. Zimmerman arrived at Widener Library accompanied by 2 associates whose professional demeanor and expensive clothing marked them as European operatives rather than academic researchers. His opening statement was arrogantly confident, reflecting his assumption that the kidnapping had forced us into complete compliance with his demands. Dr. Castellano, I'm pleased that you've recognized the wisdom of cooperating with our research efforts, he said, settling into his chair in the library's medieval manuscripts reading room. Certain historical materials have remained inappropriately separated from their proper European context for far too long. Your family's assistance in correcting this situation will be remembered gratefully. My response was carefully scripted to encourage Dr. Zimmerman to reveal details about his operation, while FBI agents monitored our conversation through sophisticated surveillance equipment concealed throughout the reading room. Dr. Zimmerman, I want to ensure my son's safety before discussing any transfer of documents. When will Robert be returned to us? His answer provided exactly the evidence that federal investigators needed to establish the criminal nature of his activities. Your son's well-being depends entirely on your cooperation, he said coldly. Once we have confirmed that all relevant materials are in our possession, arrangements will be made for his release. But understand that any attempt to retain copies or involve authorities will have permanent consequences for your family. The threat was recorded by FBI surveillance equipment and provided legal justification for immediate law enforcement action against Dr. Zimmerman and his associates. But more importantly,
His confidence led him to reveal details about the broader European operation that enabled federal agencies to identify the locations where Robert was being held and the networks that had been conducting surveillance against our family for months. Agent Chen's team moved with precision that demonstrated months of preparation for exactly this type of international criminal operation. Within 6 hours of Dr. Zimmerman's threats being recorded, federal agents had identified the suburban Boston warehouse where Robert was being held and launched a coordinated rescue operation that freed our son while apprehending his kidnappers. The warehouse raid yielded evidence that exceeded everyone's expectations. European operatives had maintained detailed files about dozens of American families suspected of possessing historical documents that could embarrass powerful continental houses. The intelligence operation had been funded by a consortium of wealthy families whose genealogies connected them directly to medieval crimes documented in various Byzantine, Venetian, and other manuscripts that had survived in private collections throughout America and Europe. Most significantly, the raids revealed that Dr. Zimmerman's operation was only one component of a comprehensive campaign designed to locate and suppress historical evidence that could expose centuries of carefully constructed lies about European noble families' roles in major historical events. The criminal network possessed resources and capabilities that enabled international operations against families and institutions throughout the Western world. Robert's rescue on January 19, 1974, marked the beginning of the end for threats that had menaced our family since Serafina first fled Venice in 1891. But it also created the opportunity we had waited 4 generations to achieve. Conditions that would allow safe revelation of the Byzantine treasure under circumstances that protected both our family and the historical documents from future suppression efforts. The third phase of our plan involved coordinating with Dr. Blackwood's international consortium to reveal the Byzantine documents through a carefully orchestrated process that would ensure their authentication, proper preservation, and protection against theft or suppression. The revelation required precise timing to maximize scholarly impact while minimizing opportunities for remaining European agents to interfere with the process. On March 15, 1974, exactly 83 years after Serafina's arrival at Ellis Island, I stood beside our family's mausoleum at Mount Auburn Cemetery as Dr. Blackwood's team prepared to open the hidden chambers that had protected priceless historical treasures through 4 generations of guardianship. The moment represented the culmination of our family's protective mission and the beginning of a new chapter that would transform understanding of medieval European history.
The opening of the hidden chambers exceeded everyone's expectations. The environmental controls that Serafina had designed and that successive generations had maintained had preserved not only the original Byzantine manuscripts, but also the photographic copies and detailed documentation that provided comprehensive evidence about Constantinople's betrayal and the systematic looting of imperial treasures by European families. The preliminary inventory revealed over 3,000 individual documents, including imperial chronicles, administrative records, diplomatic correspondence, and treasure inventories that documented the final months of the Byzantine Empire. More importantly, the collection included detailed maps showing locations where imperial treasures had been concealed throughout the Mediterranean, potentially leading to additional archaeological discoveries worth hundreds of millions of dollars. But the true significance of the revelation extended far beyond monetary value. The Byzantine documents provided unprecedented insight into political and economic networks that had shaped European development for over 5 centuries. They revealed systematic betrayals, hidden collaborations, and secret treasure transfers that challenged fundamental assumptions about medieval European history and the origins of modern European power structures. The International Consortium's authentication process required 6 months of intensive analysis by scholars from 12 countries, but the results were conclusive. The documents were genuine imperial records from the final period of the Byzantine Empire,
preserved under extraordinary circumstances that had maintained their integrity throughout over 5 centuries of concealment and protection. The revelation's impact on academic scholarship was immediate and transformative. Universities throughout America and Europe launched research projects designed to investigate the implications of the Byzantine documents, while museums and cultural institutions competed to display artifacts that rewrote accepted narratives about medieval European history. More importantly for our family's security, the public revelation of the documents and their historical significance made it impossible for remaining European agents to suppress or destroy the evidence they contained. The manuscripts had been authenticated by international experts, copied for distribution to major research institutions, and protected by governmental and academic organizations with sufficient resources to deter retaliation from threatened families. The legal consequences for Dr. Zimmerman and his associates were severe and comprehensive. Federal prosecutions for kidnapping, extortion, and cultural trafficking resulted in lengthy prison sentences, while international cooperation agreements enabled European authorities to investigate and prosecute the broader criminal networks that had funded their operations. Most satisfying was the exposure of the European families whose ancestors' crimes were documented in the Byzantine manuscripts. Several noble houses that had maintained their reputations for centuries as defenders of Christian Europe were revealed to have been active collaborators in Christianity's greatest defeat. The scandals destroyed political careers, triggered legal investigations, and forced families to acknowledge historical truths they had spent fortunes to suppress. The financial benefits to our family were substantial, but secondary to our sense of finally completing the mission that Serafina had begun when she fled Venice in 1891. The international consortium provided compensation for our decades of protection and preservation efforts, while various governments offered rewards for information that led to the apprehension of cultural trafficking networks. More importantly, the revelation enabled us to transform the Morrison Foundation into a legitimate center for Byzantine studies, without the secrecy and security concerns that had dominated our lives for 4 generations. Our children could grow up with normal lives, free from the knowledge that deadly enemies might threaten them for accidents of birth and family history. The museum that was established at Mount Auburn Cemetery became one of America's premier centers for medieval studies, attracting thousands of visitors annually to learn about Byzantine history and the extraordinary story of how priceless historical documents had been preserved through 4 generations of guardianship. The museum itself, with its elaborate security systems and symbolic carvings, became a testament to the ingenuity and determination of a woman who had saved irreplaceable evidence of historical truth. As I stood in that museum on March 15, 1984, exactly 10 years after the revelation of our family's treasure, watching my children guide visitors through exhibits that told Serafina's story and explained the historical significance of the documents she had died to protect, I reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought us from the brink of losing everything to becoming custodians of one of the most significant archaeological discoveries of the modern era. The treasure she had hidden in America had provided security for 4 generations of her family while preserving historical truth for posterity. Her greatest gift wasn't the $600 million worth of artifacts she had concealed, but her unwavering belief that truth would eventually triumph over the lies that powerful people used to hide their crimes. Sometimes, the greatest treasures are the ones that previous generations have already found for us, buried deep enough that only those willing to risk everything to preserve them will ever discover their true value.